Welcome to the Zoe.Leadership podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Well, hey ho, it's Zoe and welcome to the show. Cool things happening on planet Human. We've got the advent of the Universal Translator, otherwise known as the Babelfish in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Ever since I read that book 20, 30 years ago, the idea of having a little thing that you put in your ear and translate in real time what the other person was saying was such an important innovation. Now, we kind of have that a little bit with Google Translate, but it's clunky. We still have a couple of companies that are looking to do this real-time translation. We've got Birdhouse with a Y, who is trying to get its Universal Translator up and going. And we've got Google's Universal Translator being applied in beta to videos. So the idea is that as you watch a video, you can put the plugin in there and it dubs over the video in real time in the language of your choice. Very cool. We're getting closer and closer to the Babelfish experience, which doesn't mean we don't need to learn anybody else's languages. There's still something to be said to learn somebody else's native language. I've been studying Japanese for the last several months, and it is not that easy to learn their characters, first of all, the written language, because they have three kind of different alphabets or character alphabets. So trying to learn that and vocabulary at the same time and the rhythm of the language. This is why I think it's important to learn another language, because the rhythm and the sounds of a language actually creates a different life experience when you're talking about different things. So when I speak French, my sense of the world is slightly different than when I speak English because of the rhythm and the tone and the expressions of that particular language. Those are two languages I know well. And learning a third one is Spanish. I know a little bits and pieces of that. But really diving into Japanese changes again. It just gives you an expansion of a sense of the world. So yeah, I totally encourage people to learn another language because it expands your thinking and expands your perspective. And when you see more, you lead better. So learning a language can help you absolutely do that. So on planet Zoe, where am I in the world today? I am heading back to WA very shortly for another leadership program in the outdoors. I'm just loving going back to my roots and doing this kind of work. The coming together of other humans to problem solve in real time, in close proximity, in beautiful places is something that we should all experience. It is such a privilege to do it. And to have such beautiful places in the world like we do in Australia, like down in Margaret River, is just stunning country. Absolutely love it. So on to today's guest. Doug Thorpe is my guest, and he is a prolific writer and podcaster. He's got a great podcast called Leadership Powered by Common Sense, which is awesome. And we focus on trust at work. He is a very experienced executive professional with a history or background in banking and successful businesses. And now he is a leadership consultant. And what we talk about is really about how we actually build trust and success in a team. So my question for you is, do you know what the flywheel of team trust and success actually is? Well, my guest today, Doug Thorpe, helps us unpack all of that. So let's get into it. All the way from Houston, Texas. Welcome to the show, Doug Thorpe.
Hi, Zoe. Pleasure to be here, and welcome to the audience.
Yeah, I love this topic. It's such a fundamental one, trust at work. So it's a long way from author of talking about trust at work, which is a huge leadership question, to where you started. So how did you get into this line of work?
Well, for me, the whole topic of leadership has been a lifelong passion. I tell the story that at a young age, I was blessed with opportunities to be in roles of responsibility and leadership. I loved it. I loved the sense of service to others that I could fulfill with those opportunities, and I became a student of it. have pursued it. Right out of college, I was commissioned in the U.S. military, spent some time doing that, then left military armed services and went into banking of all things, but
Wow.
was immediately put into management roles and responsibilities because largely of my Army experience, and immediately got on the management track there and spent the next 20 years doing various and progressively more responsible things. Continued to grow all that, and then long about 2008, when we went through the Great Recession here in the States and other parts of the world as well, the opportunity came to coach and lead others, and coaching became a new passion of mine, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's really wonderful. So I love the way that you started this, where you said that you had opportunities early on to be in leadership positions, and it was the service to others that you enjoyed. And I'm curious about that as a young person, because that takes a lot of self-awareness to go, oh, I'm serving others as something that I like about leadership. Is that something that you realized back then, that it was service to others opposed to being in charge and the whole energizing aspect of power? I'm really curious about that.
Great question. And my recall of it is that I never aspired or agreed to take those assignments because of that sense of authority that came with it. I just saw it as interesting challenge. And usually the team or the group or the club or the organization that existed that needed leadership was there for other purposes. And the classic story at my house is I made it to be captain of the crossing guard in elementary school. And back in the day, we let students take sticks and walk out into traffic and stop cars so other students could cross the road. We don't do that anymore, but once upon a time, we did operate that way, and I got to be on that team. And I just saw it as a great service, and people were safely crossing the street, getting to school, and I was just energized by that.
Oh my God, that's so funny, because I was captain of the patrols at my elementary school. So exact same position. I had a completely different experience. Sounds like you were way more mature than me. So my first leadership experience, that one, was double standards, actually. And it was my sister who pointed it out. So I was captain of the patrol, same deal. We had these little flags to stop traffic and let other kids cross the road. And I would yell at kids like, no running across the road, because that was one of the rules. And I'd finish my shift, and what did I do? I ran across the road. And my sister said, hey, you just told everybody else not to do that. Why are you doing it? And I went, 'cause I can. And that was my first little insight that, maybe I need to role model things if I'm going to be doing this thing. So I love the fact that you were much more generous hearted than certainly I was. I was certainly energized by the power and command aspect of leadership or being with authority.
I'm not going to swear I didn't do any of that. It's just, I guess I have a different recall of it, and maybe my fellow students would say otherwise. But anyway, I counted it as a good opportunity and kind of a springboard to other things.
Awesome. One of the things that you write about in your book is the imposter syndrome. And I tell you what, it is one of the most common conversations I have with leaders that I work with. I feel like an imposter. I don't know if I'm up to it. One day they're just going to find out that I don't know really what I'm doing, that I'm just making it up as I go along. So what's your take on the imposter syndrome?
Well, first off, I will say it is very real, and it is more widespread than most people know. Because I've had a chance to work with literally hundreds of leaders in many different industries and walks of life, stages of life, I have run into that on a regular basis. And when I have clients who report that to me as their concern, that is one of the first things I try to convince them is that you are not alone. You are not unique in perhaps feeling that way. And usually the way we start handling it or dealing with it, obviously first I'll have them explain it further to me. What exactly are they sensing and feeling? And there are usually different paths that can take, but ultimately it comes down to a kind of a fear that I am somehow going to be less than what people expect of me. And I have known CEOs of large corporations, when they take the seat, they may have had 20, 25, 30 years of solid experience behind them. But when it's their role, all of a sudden that imposter syndrome creeps in.
It is really astonishing how prevalent it is. And exactly that. The most seasoned and accomplished leaders can still feel trepidations about taking on the role. Do you think there's anything useful in it?
Well, I think for the person that is reasonably emotionally intelligent, I think it's a good warning sign, but it is not the end of the journey by any means. I think it's a good checkpoint to look around and determine what might you be doing different to help secure that a little differently. Perhaps, for instance, they're not relying on the team that has been assembled around them. Maybe they're not doing enough leveraging of the talent and skill and experience around them. Maybe they are in some way or form afraid of what they're going to learn when they really open the door and let others start contributing. But I view those, again, I go back to those that are a little more aware of gaps and limits. It's a healthy gut check opportunity to say, all right, yes, this is a checkpoint for me, but what can I do to make it different and let it be better?
I like that, as that idea, that sort of self-doubt, which imposter syndrome is a checkpoint, as a way of saying, okay, pause. I don't know everything. Great. So introduce humility and curiosity to your leadership practice and go, right, where can I lean on others? Where can I get more feedback? Where can I grow? What do I need to learn? I think that's the useful aspect out of imposter syndrome, is using it as a checkpoint, but not to get paralyzed by it. And I think that's where people feel really troubled by it, or leaders feel really troubled by it. It's like, it's overwhelming, that sense of self-doubt. And they often think, how can I become confident? They want to jump past the learning stage to the other side of it and just go from self-doubt to confident. And I think it's the courage to look at what's going on, the courage to try new things that can help bridge that gap. And you've talked about a couple of different things in terms of leaning on your people and looking around you and so on. One of the things that you talk about in your book, Trust at Work, is trust. Obviously, it's well titled. And I think that's one of the other really big conversations that leaders and teams are having in the workplace, particularly following COVID or throughout COVID, is trust. They don't trust me to work from home, was the one thing. Or I don't trust my people to work from home because I don't know what they're doing. I rang them in the middle of the day and they're at the gym. They're supposed to be doing X. So how do we actually turn that around, whether it's a remote team or not? What are the steps that leaders can do to build trust in their team, trust amongst team members, and trust in their leadership? And I'm not sure if it's different strategies for each of them.
Well, the approach I took in the book, and it is, by the way, co-authored by a colleague of mine, a gentleman I've known, his name's Roger Ferguson. We've worked together for 30 plus years. We came upon this model a number of years ago, and we decided to write a book on it. And ironically, we began work on the book before COVID. In 2018, the good folks at Google did a massive study in their workplace about high-performing teams. And for those who may want to look it up, it was nicknamed Project Aristotle. It is publicly available to read. And the fundamental question was a simple one. They said, we have an infamous process for hiring the best of the best people to join our company, but why don't all of our teams work at the same level of excellence? And so they embarked on a 2-year study. The final outcome was published in 2018. And at the top of the list was this thing they called psychological safety. But if you read the vernacular and all of the words, and I always tout myself as a common sense guy, I kind of boiled through all the fancy jargon. And I said to myself, they're talking about old-fashioned trust. Do I trust my boss? Do I trust my coworker? Do I trust the company? Do I trust everyone around me? If I do, I will be willing to perform at a much higher level. And when you get that in a collective at the team level, you create a dynamic that is really unbeatable. So my partner and I said, well, that's interesting because guess what? We've already got a model that helps leaders figure out how to build this environment of trust. And at the core of the model is a very old-fashioned and somewhat simple principle. And I use the analogy when you think about if you're young in life and you're thinking about finding that significant other to partner up with, what do? You definitely want it to be a trust relationship. And so you go through a process of asking questions, having dialogue, exchanging ideas, and consciously or subconsciously, you're checking boxes that say, these answers align with how I would like to look at the world. Or, maybe it's you deem them somebody that can help you do something different and be something different. So that's a good thing, though, and you make that connection. And through their own performance, they prove to you that what they said can be actionable, and they will operate and show up that way using those values. So in our book, we take the approach for leaders that there are 6 fundamental areas that you can strive to answer all the questions. Because guess what? Every one of your employees ultimately shows up with questions. And it's the questions that lead to the ability to build and earn trust.
So this is leadership dating. I love it. Team dating, leadership and team dating.
Team and leadership dating, right, at its core. And the challenge maybe has been traditionally people that have moved into management positions have done it more by osmosis than by intentional development. And maybe they've modeled from a former boss who was, in all truth, not that good a boss, but, got the numbers done, but they didn't necessarily endear anybody. And as the old saying goes, people join companies, but they quit bosses. And it's usually and ultimately a function of a broken trust that makes them want to quit.
Yeah, that's right. So it's how people are treated, and trust is an element of that. So I'm curious, what's on the leadership dating hit list? You said 6 factors. What are those factors?
Yeah, 6 areas. And we have done this work at the team level of some very large companies, and we've had proof positive in the efficacy of this working out. So if you think about it, and I go back to my premise that trust is built on a question process. So the first set of big questions is something we call the people question, and it's a very fundamental one. The individual is asking the question, do I even want to be here? It's a very basic. And you would think when someone takes on a job or accepts a transfer that there's an inherent implied, yes, I want to be there. But as soon as they hit the ground and they start meeting people and they start learning about the environment, they fall back to this very fundamental, do I even want to be here? And it's almost related to the first rung on Maslow's hierarchy. Can I be safe here? Are all my animalistic needs being met? And, all those basic things. But once you get past that, you move on to the second area, which is about purpose, understanding the purpose. Why does this team exist? Where are we going? And so what? And often leaders don't do a real good job of explaining why the team exists. So people are thrust into work, but they don't understand the definition of the bigger picture. How do we fit into the scheme of things? So it's on the leader to help explain and promote the idea of purpose for the group.
What do you think is Doug, I'm just curious about this one too. What's the best way for leaders to explain the why? I mean, I'm thinking just from a technical explanation of the why. Is it verbally? Is it pictorially? Is it a diagram? Like, how do we represent to our team members how we fit in?
Well, I've had it fed back to me by some leaders who say, Doug, what you're talking about is I need to explain to my team what a win looks like. If we win at what we're doing, what is that? How does it serve the greater good of the company we are a part of? How do we feed the machine or feed the engine? And how do we contribute to that accomplishment of the greater good? And I would argue that, again, largely from my own experience, that surprisingly, leaders in the middle levels of organizational structure don't necessarily do a good job of even comprehending that for themselves, much less explain it to their team.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, they're given a slice of the pie, and it's, whatever the discipline might be, maybe they're engineering, maybe they're marketing, maybe they're sales or whatever, and they're given some numbers as quotas. But you scratch your head and say, yeah, but so what? What does that really mean to what we're doing here?
Yeah, I think you're right. And it does, because when you become a new manager, a new leader, all of a sudden your scope of awareness needs to increase. Does it necessarily automatically do that? Maybe not. And it's something that we need to learn how to do as leaders, is to understand the environment in which we're operating, the context, the systems of the business, and how the business sits within the greater community and business landscape. And that takes some learning to understand all of that, and then to translate that in a meaningful way that's useful to the people that we're leading, given whatever they're doing, is certainly a communication and awareness challenge for sure. It does surprise me that we don't teach leaders how to do this better. But I think one of the ways that I like to teach leaders how to do it is actually to draw a diagram and to represent it, like not just a flow chart is the typical org chart is where people show that, but that just shows lines of authority. It doesn't necessarily demonstrate how we all fit together in terms of supporting the outcomes of the business.
Right. Yeah. So we got the people question, the purpose question, and the third area is the plan. If you understand the purpose, what's the plan? How are we going to execute? How are we going to achieve and accomplish that purpose? And we all know that you can have an idea, and once you attempt the planning process, you might find roadblocks or hurdles that seem insurmountable and seem daunting, and maybe even in some cases they convince you to go another way. It's just too big a hurdle, so you've got to modify your expectation to move forward. But again, similar to the purpose question, it's interesting to me how seldom leaders migrate into a willingness to map out the plan for their team on what kind of work we're doing. And it's particularly true in environments where the work is a little more repetitive and redundant. Like, well, I'll use the example. I'm an old banker. We use transaction processing at the bank. You wake up every day, you're going to have a stack of transactions that have to get posted and modified or entered into the system. Well, that's an incredibly mundane and repetitive task. The dollar amounts change on every one, but the process is fundamentally the same. But mapping out both the purpose and the plan for how that helps accomplish a greater good and keeping that out in front of your people for good understanding is the critical part. And then the fourth area is something I call practice. If you understand the purpose and the plan, when I go sit down or I go to my workstation, what tools do I have? What resources do I have? When the rubber hits the road, what do I have to work with here? And in some cases, I use the example, you may have what you think is a great purpose. You've got a great plan. You think about it. But when you go sit down to do the work, you discover there's a company policy that prohibits doing X, Y, or Z. And you've got to go, oh, well, maybe I need to go talk to the higher ups about this policy. Is that policy really applicable in today's market? Do we need to have that discussion? Or it could be something as direct as bad equipment. The equipment is old and broken down and doesn't work as efficiently as it should. And those kind of solutions are more classically thought of as managerial tasks. How do I equip my people? How do I prepare them for success with the right resources, the right tools, the right process to get them through the work? So that's number 4. Number 5 is having to do with performance, and it's a very personal question that people ask and have been asking for a long time. If I do all this work, if I follow all these things, am I going to get recognized and rated properly? And is the system for rating equitable? Is it fair? Is it meaningful? And how do we do that? And the last one, real quick for time's sake, number 6 is payoff. And I always quickly go to the comp thing. Payoff is not limited to compensation. Payoff is that sense of, in fact, contributing to the greater good for doing all these other 5 things around the wheel. And then we teach this and we demonstrate it as a diagram of kind of a wheel. When you get through the first 5 areas, then you get to that final question of payoff. So what? We did all that. How do we feel about that? And for that one, I point to my opportunity at the bank. We had an amazing bank organization that I worked for. We were a large regional bank in the United States. And we put together a purpose and a plan that helped us achieve 64 consecutive quarters of earnings growth. That's 16 years of perpetual growth as a bank. And after we made it through the first 5 or 6 quarters, we kind of scratched our head and said, maybe we're onto something here. Maybe we've figured out the formula. Maybe we know a little bit about doing this. And then we ran off 3 or 4 more quarters. We were coming up on 2 years and we said, yeah, we definitely have something here. How do we teach it? How do we coach it? How do we manage it? And then it started permeating the organization, and it became a kind of a badge of pride. And, you get to 10 or 12 quarters, and all of a sudden you're saying, I can't break this chain. I'm not going to be the guy that makes the decision that breaks this chain. So our committee process got a lot more collaborative and a lot more open and vocal about ways to make big decisions that would be successful. And it became a snowball effect of success. And one of the reasons we map all this out in the book in a kind of a wheel is that it actually becomes a flywheel of success. And if you know anything about a flywheel, it's a very large piece of a system. It takes a lot of energy to get it started, but once it builds momentum, it takes even more energy to stop it.
Yeah. And just wondering about that too. So 16 quarters, successive quarters of growth, which or 16 years, you said, 16 years, not 16 quarters, 16 years. Did it stop in the end?
Well, what ended up happening, and keep in mind, for 16 years in U.S. economic history, this started in the early 80s and went all the way into the 90s. We went through 2 different oil crashes and 2 different real estate crashes.
And a recession, and a big recession in there too.
And a recession.
Yeah.
And the, God love him, the Jimmy Carter years when prime rate went up to 21%. So the economy was just on the rails and on the ropes. But we as a bank continued to make the adjustments, make the changes, and continue the decisions we did as a leadership team to sustain that growth. And it became a culture unto itself, and there was a kind of a pride. And so back to my slot number 6 on my model, the payoff, we were very proud to be members of that organization running off a string like that. But to your question, why did it end? Well, there was a lot of things going on in the U.S. banking world at the time, and we were acquired by a New York money center bank that ultimately, and I won't bore you with all the iterations, but bottom line, it is now what you know as Chase, JP Morgan Chase.
Right, okay.
So we were purchased by the predecessor of Chase. And it was actually the Chemical Bank of New York. And it was Chemical Bank that bought the old Chase Manhattan. but kept the name. And then in the late 90s, Bank One in the US actually bought Chase and kept the name.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, then, I mean, when you get a buyout like that, that is a takeover of culture and practice. And so the opportunity to manage your flywheel gets scuppered a little bit because you've got to fit into a larger entity that's got its own way of doing things. So is that what happened? It kind of just got...
Yeah, ultimately that's what happened. But it was interesting through that dynamic. And I talk about this in my own podcast. When our bank in Texas was acquired by Chemical Bank, we were worried about the culture fit in Texas versus New York. There was a real concern on both sides. And at the time, there was a very cheesy commercial for a canned chili product called Wolf Brand. And their tagline was, New York City, why are we doing New York City? And that kind of spilled over into our merger discussion. But the blessing in all that, it turned out the legacy Chemical Bank team and our team, the culture could not have been a better fit. The way we looked at banking, the way we organized teams and process and projects, and it was a very harmonious merger. And the chairman of Chemical came to us and said, I am buying a franchise. And he jokingly, as a New Yorker, looked at us and said, I think the phrase down here is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, that's what I'm doing. You ain't broke, I'm not fixing anything. And you know what he did? We operated under our logo and our banner for another 10 years. We did not change our name to be Chemical Bank of New York. We retained our Texas name. And then when the merger with Chase happened, that one was not so pretty. The legacy Chase people and the legacy, what was now Chemical, was oil and water. It was ugly. It was a very ugly merger.
Okay. Well, it all comes down to culture in the end. So your 6 Ps is basically a template for culture as well as performance, which I think is lovely. All right. So new manager, first-time manager, facing lots of challenges. We've got the 6P plan. Is that where leaders can start, new leaders and manager, or is there something even more basic than that they can start with?
No, I regularly encourage people to adopt that mindset and that view of opportunity there. But when I do start coaching with a newly appointed or newly emerging leader in an organization, we do spend some time really probing the question, is there a difference between management and leadership? And part of it is to kind of level set the lens and look at opportunity that may come by saying, yeah, there is a difference. What do I need to do to become a better leader? And then we can start setting a development roadmap for that individual to explore and align for better leadership performance from them.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Doug, are you ready for the Fast Five?
Okay, shoot.
What is the future technology you most want right now?
Well, when I saw that question, Zoe, I was worried about, everybody's talking about AI. And in fact, just before I got online, one of my coaching colleagues sent me a note, and he attended an ICF, International Coaching Federation panel about it. And apparently there's a really interesting video I need to look at. So I think AI is the great unknown. Is it going to be the next revolutionary wave to hit the entire business world, if not the planet? I think the easy answer is yes, it's going to be. So positioning as a leader in an organization, number one, learning what AI is about and learning how to leverage it properly, I think is going to be the big challenge for leaders in the near future.
Okay. What's the best tip you ever got for leadership?
I think the best thing I would have to say is don't sweat the small stuff. And I think the subtitle on that book is Everything is Small Stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not sure that's quite true, but I think there is a risk of getting bogged down in a lot of noise and details that you don't have to. And I think I've done a lot of work with leaders since the pandemic of having that struggle of sifting through all the noise and finding their own critical path for what really needs to be done. What are the big things that need to be accomplished, and let all the little stuff fall by the wayside.
Okay, that's a good one. All right, number 3, what's one problem at work you'd love to wave a magic wand and be fixed right now?
I would like to wave that wand and eliminate any argument about the difficulty and the generational difference in the workplace. I'm a contrarian on that subject. And what I mean by that is, for an older leader to say, I can't deal with the younger generation and kind of throw their hands up, that's just an easy excuse.
Yep. Okay. Because they're humans.
They're humans.
Yeah. All right. Nice. Number 4, thumbs up or thumbs down. Who is a leader that is doing something right, or a leader that's doing something wrong out there right now?
Boy, again, when I read that question, it's too easy an answer to jump on the political bandwagon, and I'm not going to do that. I think a guy that's doing something right now in business, and I am going to stay close to my roots and point to banking. I think Jamie Dimon at Chase has done a lot of things right for that organization and for the banking world. And I know he's taken to some podiums that you kind of raise your eyebrows and go, is he going to run for president? What's he doing? So I would be okay if he did that. I'll say it that way.
So is there an example of one thing that he's done that you went, yeah, that's a good thing to do?
Well, he has done a lot, especially through the pandemic, of speaking to workforce concerns and being an incredibly empathetic listener to the concerns that the workforce has brought to him about the challenges, all aspects of the challenges of the COVID work world. And I think he's done a pretty darn good job of responding, finding answers, finding workable solutions.
Okay, awesome. And the last one, number 5, what is your favorite leadership book or podcast aside from this one and your own?
Well, I often point to, there's a book on my shelf called Lincoln on Leadership. It is an old book that was written, and I do not even recall the author's name. He's not a mainstream author, but he did a lot of very in-depth research looking through the Lincoln archives and letters to politicos and military people, and that just demonstrated the passion and the energy that Abraham Lincoln had for his commitment to his role as president of the United States at one of the worst, darkest times in U.S. history. And it's really amazing. I mean, and it covers the gamut of fortitude, vision, consistency. You name just about any leadership attribute you want to think about it. There's an example of it somewhere in Lincoln's work.
Okay. That's the second time I've had that book recommended, so there must be something in it. Thank you for that recommendation. I really appreciate it. And that was the Fast 5. The Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast is proudly sponsored by the Amplifiers Academy. It is an online self-paced leadership development program that you can join at any time and progress at your pace. There are very short video lessons, great checklists and resources and recommendations and book summaries, all there to help boost your leadership thinking and abilities. We focus on leading strategy, leading culture, leading change, and leading performance. So if you want a go-to resource that can help boost your strategic abilities immediately, check us out, Amplifiers Academy, on the ZoeRouth.com website. See you there. Okay, Doug, we're nearing the end of this fabulous interview. Wow, long-term changes in the workplace, right? Since the pandemic has happened, you've been through quite a few different phases of the workplace over the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, where are we now? Then the 2020s. Pandemic was a pretty interesting period of time. Have you noticed anything long-term that's changed since then?
The thing that keeps coming up in my work with my clients is that there is a palpable, almost measurable change in the mindset of the average employee. Once upon a time, pre-pandemic, employees at some way, some level or another had a dependency on the work. They needed the job. They needed their paycheck. They needed what the company could offer them. That fundamental mindset has gone away in by most counts. Most of the leaders I talk with, they don't believe that exists much anymore. And in other words, people are far more willing to come to work and start around my wheel of asking the 6 questions and making quick decisions about, you know what, you can't answer this well enough. I'm out. I'm gone. And they're voting with their feet, resigning and taking other jobs. So on one hand, while the job market in general has stabilized a little bit from what it was 24 months ago, I think there's still a fundamental mindset. People are not going to be willing to put up with some of the conditions that management used to dish on them and got away with. And now I think leaders are having to turn to much more of a servant leadership kind of approach, much more empathetic, much more open to collaboration and listening. And sadly, not everybody's making that shift well. So we're still going to have a little bit of friction there, but they're not going to get away with it a whole lot longer.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how it has catalyzed a few different shifts in the workplace. And I think you're right. That shift to being more compassionate and collaborative is certainly one of the key elements of that we're seeing coming out in the leadership and team space. All right, Doug, this has been fantastic. Where can people find out more about your books and you and your work?
The easiest way to do it is hop over to my website, simply DougThorpe.com. That's THORPE.com. And I've got all my reference points. There's tabs and links and other things for all the books and my podcast, plus a blog library there that speaks about a lot of these issues.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All the way from, wait a minute, I was going to say Houston. It is Houston, right? All the way from Houston.
It is. Houston, Texas. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, great. Somewhere warm I'd like to be. So thank you so much, Doug.
All right, Zoe. Thank you. It was a privilege.
Doug has such a richness and depth of experience and such a great radio voice too, right? It's like so rich and warm. Great to listen to. So the takeaway that I'm getting from this is the team and leadership dating areas. And so go ahead and answer the 6 areas and dive into them. The people. Are the people right for me? Do I like being around these people? What's the purpose? What's the plan? What's the practice, i.e. the friction and flow in the work itself? The performance, how am I getting recognized? The payoff, what does this all mean? So I love it. People, purpose, plan, practice, performance, and payoff, the 6 Ps. A tip from my book this week is my 3rd book, Loyalty, Stop Unwanted Staff Turnover, Boost Engagement, and Create Lifelong Advocates, sort of building on the theme that we had with Doug. And that's looking at how we interact on a regular basis with our people. And I called it the touchpoint cadence model. And it centers around 3 main things that you can look at. Cadence means rhythm and how often you meet with people, daily, weekly, or monthly, quarterly, and yearly. And people, process, and progress are the 3 areas to look at. The people focus is about acknowledging contributions, how people are going, how they feel about the week, checking in with the humans. What's going on in your world? How are you? And how are things going? Some recognition. And the process piece is sort of what Doug talks about around practice. What's getting in the way of us performing? What could we be cleaning up, making easier? And what's going well that we want to duplicate or repeat elsewhere? And the 3rd P for me, a lot of P's in this one today, is progress. How far have we come? And by looking backwards, we can get a sense of progress and accomplishment, as opposed to only looking at how far have we got to go. So people, process, and progress is something that you can touch base on quickly on a daily basis, weekly basis, quarterly, and yearly. All right, that's the tip of the week from me. And up next on the show, we've got a solo-sode. I'm going to be diving into the key elements of leading performance. And following that, we have an interview with Gina Huber, who will talk about a new leadership paradigm. So big picture conversation coming up in our next interview. In the meantime, I would love if you'd share a photo on social media or email me where you're listening from. And that's always really cool, except if you're driving, of course. Don't use your phone to take a photo. Maybe take a picture of your car or at the end destination or something like that. It's always fun to share where people are tuning in from. It feels more connected when we share a little bit of what's happening in your world as you dive in and listen to these conversations. In the meantime, have a wonderful week. Live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.